This is the Nourished Brain Podcast, where we explore the art and science of nutrition for brain health and mental well-being. The information provided in this podcast is for educational and informational purposes only and is not intended as medical advice. I'm your host, Sarah Thompson Fajera. Let's get started. Hi, everyone. A heads up that today's conversation includes a discussion about addiction, including some mature themes related to addiction. So if you have little ears around, wanted to let you know that before you start listening. And as always, keep in mind that this information is for informational purposes only. Please do not make any changes to your diet, supplementation, medication regimen without consulting with a qualified healthcare provider who understands your specific needs and situation. Enjoy the conversation. Thanks for being here. Christina T. Veselak, LMFT CN, is a licensed mental health therapist and certified nutritionist with over 30 years of experience. As the founder of the Academy for Addiction and Mental Health Nutrition, she trains professionals worldwide to use targeted nutritional strategies to support mental health and addiction recovery. Christina is passionate about educating others on how nutrient-driven biochemical imbalances impact behavior, mood, and cravings, and how to restore brain function for lasting recovery, which is exactly what we will focus in on today. So, Christina, thanks for joining. It's really a pleasure to be able to speak with you again.
Sarah, thank you so much for having me on your podcast.
Mm-hmm.
I'm always delighted to share this information with a broader audience because the medical profession doesn't know this, treatment professionals don't know this, and yet when I explain it to clients, when I explain it to addiction counselors and other therapists, they say, oh, that makes so much sense, and I've never heard it before. So I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to share this information with people because I have found it to be life transforming and life saving over and over and over again. And it is very evidence-based.
Christina, I am always so interested to hear how professionals walking their professional paths find themselves in these niches, find themselves specializing so deeply, especially in the areas of brain health, nutrition, mood, all of that. So tie in some of your professional journey for us. So you were a counselor for quite a while, and what were you starting to see or experience or read or become aware of that led you to start to incorporate nutrition into your work?
Well, as is often the case, my personal journey kind of intertwined with my professional journey in this. And I had had major struggles with physical illness, fatigue, depression, anxiety, ADHD, my whole life. And I discovered in college, actually, quite accidentally or providentially, that eggs made me depressed. And so by avoiding eggs, I was less depressed. I was still depressed, but it was less overwhelming. And so that was interesting to me. I actually discovered it with help in, I think it was 1976. An early edition of Prevention magazine was talking about how food allergies and intolerances could cause psychiatric symptoms. And I put two and two together and said, oh, that's me. Because it talked about how eggs, some people were particularly susceptible to getting depression from consuming eggs. So I kind of put that information in the back of my mind, never forgot it, but went on with my life egg free and got my training and started working immediately in addiction and with family members of people with addiction. But I had never, my mother was always interested in healthy eating and cooking and was a gourmet chef and wanted to make sure once she got discovered the importance of it, not in my early years, but definitely in my teenage years, she became a very healthy, natural gourmet cook. So that was kind of my underpinning. And then just around age 30, I don't know, more or less, 1990, I read a press release. I was in private practice by then, specializing in people from addicted families and working a little bit with people in addiction, but all sorts of mood disorders and trauma, etc. And I saw this press release from a company. I lived in the San Francisco Bay Area, a company across the bay, where they were using amino acids in food in an outpatient basis for addiction recovery and eating disorders. This was Julia Ross, who later ended up writing The Mood Cure and The Diet Cure, and most recently, The Craving Cure, which is a wonderful book about neurotransmitter restoration for sugar addiction. And I was really curious. So I set up an appointment and met Julia Ross and her nutritionist, Crispin Sullivan. And Crispin, when she shook my hand, said, "Oh, you're hypothyroid. You have cold, dry hands." And I thought, really? I'd been to doctors my whole entire life and nobody had ever mentioned that one. So I was intrigued. And at the end of our lovely conversation, I said, I've been ill my whole life. Do you think you could possibly help me figure it out? And she said, sure, love to try. So that was my very first introduction to, before the term was coined, functional nutrition. And so she put me on a bunch of supplements and made sure I was eating well, which I was, and nothing worked. So after a couple of weeks, she said, you don't fit all the criteria for celiac disease because you're overweight rather than skin and bones. But why don't you try going off gluten for 5 days and see what happens? So I went off gluten for 5 days and my life turned right side up.
Wow.
Right side up. I felt alive for the first time in my life. And then she referred me to an integrative doctor, and I discovered that I did so much better on thyroid medication. It turned out over the years, I figured this out layer by layer. It took me about 15 years that I had 11 different biochemical drivers for my depression, anxiety, and ADHD.
Hmm.
And so it took just about 11 years to get me finally free of all of it, which I am now and have been for a long time. So I was fascinated by this and wanted to get the same training that Crispin had and started meeting with a amino acid expert every week. We had lunch together and he trained me in amino acids. I took classes from Julia Ross as she was teaching around the Bay Area. And it was exciting. It was overwhelming. It was frightening. I'm one of these people that creeps into the swimming pool rather than jumping into the deep end. And so I started integrating it very cautiously into my practice, but not robustly. I was one of these hesitant people until I moved to Denver and got a job for 3 years working at a vitamin store, which is really frontline medical care. We're not supposed to call it that. But people come in and say, I have this condition and my doctor can't help me. Do you have ideas? Well, I was trained to have lots of ideas, many of which turned out to be rather helpful to people. Well, that gave me confidence. It gave me competence. And when I restarted my private practice in Denver in 2001 was when I fully incorporated nutrition into my work as a psychotherapist and as a relapse prevention specialist
Mm.
in the addiction field. And I asked all my colleagues in Denver to start sending me their treatment failures, all of their wonderful, motivated, passionate clients who'd gone through 5 to 10 treatment programs and three 12-step meetings a day and still couldn't make it stick. And were so discouraged and in such despair. And the therapists were pulling their hair out because they couldn't figure out what they were missing. So I said, send them to me. Let me see what I can do. Which,
Mhm.
looking back, it was like, really? And I take a lot of guts, but I did it because I had a feeling that by addressing the brain with nutrition, we would actually get traction.
Mm.
And you know what, Sarah, it worked
Mm.
because I discovered some things working with these people who were struggling so long and so hard without success is that none of them were eating consistently the foods that their brains required to function.
Mm. Mhm.
They were eating ultra processed foods, they were skipping meals. Nobody had ever told them that what and when they ate mattered to their recovery. So, in the words that many people told me, it was like, oh, I just couldn't be bothered. It
Mhm.
was too much work. It was too hard. Nobody ever taught me how to cook. It was too
Mhm.
expensive. It was. And whatever it was, pretty much 99% of the people came to me had starving brains.
Mm.
And once I got them eating 20 grams of protein as a backbone, um, every 4 hours, things started turning right side up for these people.
Mm.
Their cravings started disappearing and therefore their relapse dropped. They could access recovery skills. They now felt more stable and grounded and had better emotion regulation and could stay awake and treat in AA meetings and actually get there on time. And so they were able to start engaging in their recovery journey in a way they couldn't before because now they had a functioning brain. And I saw this over and over and over again. And whatever other issues were tripping them up, such as traumatic brain injury or ADHD or trauma, with a well fed brain, these things started becoming, they could deal with them in a way they couldn't before.
Mm.
And this so excited me, and I became so impressed by the results I was getting that in 2015, I started a school called the Academy for Addiction and Mental Health Nutrition because I wanted to teach other practitioners how to do the same thing.
Mhm.
And we're now 10 years old this
Mhm.
year.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And I now have the experience of watching practitioners, both functional nutritionists and mental health professionals, integrate this knowledge into their practice and get the same results I was getting.
Mhm.
And this is just, it's amazing because too many people have died, too many families are broken, too many
Mhm.
people are killing themselves with suicide,
Mhm.
right? Too many people are on medications that aren't working or have horrible side effects. And we have this very simple, not always easy to implement,
Mhm.
but
Mhm.
very simple solution that
Mhm.
once you give the brain the nutrients it requires in a consistent way to function, it functions, and so do we.
Mhm. And just that foundational principle of eating protein regularly, not only is there blood sugar stability, the amino acid precursors, but also some of those really important nutrients for
Mhm.
brain health, i.e., zinc, iron, B12, are often packaged in the greatest density in high quality
Absolutely.
protein foods. So So you started to see some really nice improvement with, overall kind of presentation and maybe relapse with a focus on protein. What else have you found over the years that, like, from your perspective, you feel needs to be in that foundational nutrition plan? Where just from your observations, you think, yeah, when we can focus on XYZ, people have maybe a better chance. They're doing
Sure,
better.
sure. Well, I like beginning with food and ending with food.
Mm,
So whole, minimally processed foods, lots of brightly colored veggies, the whole thing to give the brain a wide variety of the nutrients it needs. But sometimes we're not digesting it very well, or it's just hard to get enough food in every day. That's
mm.
my problem. Um, and sometimes, I mean, according to the FDA, the amount of nutrients in foods is actually significantly less than it was 150 years ago.
Mm,
So we have to eat more than our grandparents and great grandparents did to get the same amount of nutrients.
mm,
And people coming into recovery from either serious emotional disturbance or addiction have really seriously depleted nutrient stores.
mm,
So we have some repair work to do. We have some remediation to do. And so I tend to recommend good quality multivitamin,
mm,
a good quality high dose fish oil.
mm,
And there are vegan ways of getting your EPA and DHA as well.
mm,
And then, so that's a foundation. Getting that food in, adding a good multivitamin. Um, and by good, I mean it doesn't have food coloring or carnauba wax
mm,
or other additives that we just don't need in either our food or our vitamins.
mm,
And usually greater than the RDA. We need more nutrients than those required to keep us from dying from a nutrient deficient illness. Okay, so we want some solid doses in there. And then the fish oil so that we get the omega 3s because most of us don't get enough in our diet. And that's
That's so
the
true.
foundation. On top of that, different people need different support
Mm,
depending upon where they're vulnerable.
mm,
If we have a lot of GI distress, we may need to bring in GI anti-inflammatories or digestive enzymes. If we have a lot of brain inflammation, we may need to bring in brain neural anti-inflammatories on top of the fish oil, like NAC, phosphatidylserine. Some of your anti-inflammatory herbs are really helpful. If somebody has really harmed their liver, we may need to bring in herbs and nutrients that support liver.
mm,
This includes, again, N-acetylcysteine or NAC and milk thistle and maybe, some beets, some other nutrients that are very supportive to liver health. And then this kind of goes on. But
mm,
sometimes adding some lithium orotate if you have a lot of mood swinging or tend to get angry or violent or just agitated and anxious. And then, of course, our amino acids. And amino acids are a game changer because not only can we get them from food, but we can buy them over the counter. And I think of them and all these other nutrients as purified food. So we
mm,
begin with food, we end with food, and in the
mhm.
middle, we might use some purified food for however long you need to.
So talk a bit about some of some of the benefits you think are present with maybe different amino acids, whether through food or supplementation.
Sure,
Which do you think are driving meaningful impact, and what do you tend to turn toward or focus on with people?
absolutely. So to answer that question, we need to briefly review our four brain neurotransmitter, mood mediating neurotransmitter systems. So neurotransmitters in the brain and body are signaling mechanisms that mediate mood, behavior, the ability to learn skills, the ability to have choice, the ability to have energy, motivation, and drive, or feel safe and relaxed enough to play and sleep. So, and I could go on and on. Um, these neurotransmitters are made out of amino acids from the protein we eat in the presence of vitamins and minerals, and we need all the right fats in order to them to be properly transmitted. So that's brain neurochemistry 101 in 30 seconds. There's four major neurotransmitter systems. The first one, and the one that most people involved in addiction have heard over and over and over again, is dopamine. So dopamine, norepinephrine, adrenaline all kind of run together. They're called the catecholamines, and they're made out of one amino acid called tyrosine. You can buy tyrosine over the counter, and aminos actually cross the blood-brain barrier when taken orally and start making new neurotransmitter within 20 minutes. This has been well established in research. And tyrosine gives us, brightness, brightness of mood, brightness of energy, brightness of cognition, can eliminate brain fog, can get us out of the doldrums. It's for the mild, even severe depression where you just don't care anymore and just don't have the energy or drive to do anything. Or your brain is all over the place with ADHD. That was me. Then we have serotonin. And everybody's heard of serotonin because of SSRIs like Prozac, your selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Well, before they were on the market, before they were created, psychiatrists were using the amino acid tryptophan to support serotonin and melatonin to support sleep. And it was wonderful for people with an anxious, agitated depression, with ruminating thoughts or worry that they couldn't turn off and that would keep them awake at night because things are just going round and round and round. And tryptophan was wonderful at reducing this anxious, agitated depression, reducing worry, and helping people sleep. Research goes back on this to the 70s. So there was a kerfuffle in the late 1980s when they were trying to get Prozac onto the market, and tryptophan ended up being removed from the market by the FDA. Well, in the meantime, somebody discovered that there's this other chemical that tryptophan turns into on its way to serotonin, and that's 5-HTP. Well, they found that 5-HTP lived in this plant called Griffonia found in South Africa. So they started manufacturing 5-HTP from Griffonia, selling it over the counter. And now people didn't need tryptophan anymore because you could buy 5-HTP from your vitamin store. So after a while, the FDA released tryptophan again because there wasn't actually a problem with tryptophan. There was just a problem with some manufacturing practices.
There's a sourcing issue, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And so we now have tryptophan and 5-HTP, which work slightly differently or have slightly different effects to support serotonin within 20 minutes. Then we have GABA, and you want to start with the low dose of GABA at first, because if you get too much, it can be counterproductive. So you keep raising the dose till you find your own little sweet spot. it again works in 20 minutes and it helps relax our muscles, relax into sleep. It gives us a buffer against distraction and, loud noises and loud sounds and, things that, scratchy clothes.
Mm.
So GABA is really useful in that regard. And then there's a number of other nutrients kind of in the GABA family, my favorite of which is theanine. I love theanine. So theanine does a number of different things in the brain, including and especially blocking our stress hormones. Partially, not 100%, but it lowers our glutamate, it lowers our cortisol, it lowers our adrenaline, the effect on our brain and body. And so it's really wonderful if you're over upset, if you are in sympathetic arousal because something bad happened or you got into a fight or you're dealing with PTSD. It's wonderful for the ADHD, and this is where I use it a lot. Sometimes we feel like there's way too much coming in our little brains or way too much expected of our brains, and we start spinning. It's like, should I do this or should I do that or should I do that? And we get, at least me, really anxious.
Mm.
And the anxiety goes up, and then we freeze. We get out of our window of tolerance and we freeze and can't do anything and just run away, procrastinate,
Mm.
do it tomorrow, get somebody else to do it, conveniently forget about it.
Mm.
Oops. Okay. Um, Theanine within 20 minutes stops the spin, slows down the anxiety, allows us to breathe and think through what we have to do and do our to-do list one at a time rather than having it
Mhm.
like being a tornado spin around our little heads. So that's theanine.
Mm. I remember seeing a research paper recently where theanine and caffeine were combined,
Mm-hmm.
and individuals with ADHD had better focus with
They
both
did.
combined versus
Better
just
focus and better
caffeine. Yeah.
and better
Yeah.
concentration.
Mm-hmm.
And the theanine keeps the caffeine from giving you the jitters.
Mm-hmm. It's not as stimulating. Nah, nah, nah. Yeah.
Right. Right. It smooths out the effect of the
Mm-hmm.
caffeine.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
Yeah. You get that in green tea too, right? You get both.
You do. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It was
Yeah.
originally extracted from green tea.
Mm-hmm. Where is it extracted from now?
I think I
Mostly
think now it's just made,
just made. Yeah.
synthesized in the lab, although it
Mm-hmm.
can still be extracted from
Yeah.
green tea.
From green
I
tea.
think it's cheaper to just synthesize it.
Probably. Right. Right.
Yeah.
So what about any kind of top food sources of any of these? So the green tea for theanine, anything you guide people toward or
You know, they're varied. Most of these amino acids are found in a wide variety of your protein foods,
right?
or your brain will make it
Mm-hmm.
from other things. So this is where I go back to the 20 grams of protein every 4 hours.
Mm-hmm.
People can get by with less. Many people need a lot more, actually.
Mm-hmm.
So, um, so just eating a wide variety of fruits and veggies and your proteins, not too much fruit. We don't want too much sugar, but the really colorful ones and the berries are so good for us.
Mm-hmm. And this is probably a good moment to mention that there are some amino acids that are considered essential
Yes.
versus non-essential, right? To your point
Hmm.
that our bodies can create some amino acids on its own, but really our brains and bodies cannot make a
No,
number of these essential amino acids. So intake in
no,
one form or another is really critical. Yeah, for
it's
functioning.
really critical.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There's 9 of them. There's 22 amino acids in all, but 9 of them are essential, and we
Yeah.
have to get them from food.
Mm-hmm.
And then the brain can make other things from them, like tryptophan's essential.
Mm-hmm.
L-phenylalanine turns into tyrosine. Now, we
Mm-hmm.
can find tyrosine in food too,
Mm-hmm.
but the body can make it from
Can
your
make it.
L-phenylalanine.
Yeah. So, Christina, what about cautions or contraindications for the amino acid specific element of this? Anything that you just think about or caution people around or screen for?
So in general, they're very safe. Our bodies know how to use them. We trial them to find the effective dose because everybody has biochemical individuality. I had one client who needed a literal fingertip of tyrosine. She licked her finger, dipped it in the powder, and licked it off. And that overcame her treatment resistant major depression in 20 minutes. Somebody else with exactly the same symptoms required 3 grams of tyrosine to get the same effect. So you want to start low and maybe go lower or build up to the dose you need. If you have cancer, if you have serious kidney disease or liver disease, you want to be very cautious about using any of the amino acids, and you really want to be working, for instance, with a naturopathic oncologist so you know what's safe for your particular cancer.
Mhm.
Um, and you probably want to be getting a handle on the kidney and liver disease before you want to bring in anything purified,
Mm.
right?
Mhm.
Other than that, knowing what the aminos do are going to help you think through. So, since tyrosine can turn into adrenaline, which can raise our blood pressure, if you've got really high blood pressure, you probably don't want to use tyrosine until you've managed your blood pressure.
Mhm.
Conversely, if you've got POTS or you've got very low blood pressure, you don't want to use GABA, which lowers blood pressure,
Mm.
until you have that under control.
Mhm.
But since GABA does lower blood pressure, it's great if you have hypertension.
Mm.
It's one of the tools you can bring in
Mhm. Can bring
to
in.
manage your hypertension.
Mm.
And then there's other kind of cautions and things with, well, I've already mentioned cancer.
Yeah.
With tyrosine, you definitely don't want to use it if you have a melanoma because tyrosine apparently feeds melanomas. Want to be cautious there. If you have a tyramine type migraine headache, you want to use an herb called Mucuna pruriens to support dopamine rather than your tyrosine. And so I teach all of these nuances and intricacies to practitioners and anybody else who wants to learn um, through my school. But then Julia Ross also wrote a wonderful book called The Mood Cure, where
Mhm.
she goes through
I
each
read
amino
that.
acid and how to use them
Yeah.
and what the precautions are, and that's useful. We
Mhm.
actually use a neurotransmitter depletion chart created by Julia as a way of determining which neurotransmitters need support and what amino acids you can use
Mm.
to support that. So it's a
Mhm.
wonderful tool.
Mhm. What about tryptophan? Because, I'm aware that tryptophan, at least theoretically, can go down these different pathways. Yes.
Mhm,
Where if
mhm.
there's chronic inflammation present, it can, that pathway of more the kynurenine, if I'm saying it right, it goes down that
Tyrenin.
pathway. Is that something that you think about or that comes into practice? I've wondered about that with the amino acid therapy in the past.
So sometimes we prefer using tryptophan to 5-HTP, especially at bedtime, because it's a little more sedating.
Mm,
Sometimes 5-HTP can bring cortisol along with it and can be great during the day, but can be a little too activating at bedtime
mm,
and can actually interfere with sleep. The way you know whether tryptophan is going to be useful for you is whether or not it works. Because I said aminos work within 20 minutes, and if with the lowest dose it doesn't work, you raise it a couple of times to see what
Mhm.
response you get. If you're not getting any response from tryptophan at all, it means that it's going down another pathway. It could be
Mm.
turned into niacin to make NAD, which we
Mm.
need to stay alive, or it could go down an inflammatory pathway. But the way you know is how you feel on it.
Mm.
And you don't have to like be on it for 6 weeks to see if it's going to work. We're talking a day.
Yeah, yeah.
We're talking one or two
You see
doses.
differences really quickly, it sounds
You see
like.
differences
Yeah.
really quickly. So, for instance, my daughter needed to go on this in middle school, and she just, Mom, I just don't like tryptophan. She couldn't tell me why. She just didn't like it. Well, it turned out she was sitting on a lot of inflammation, but she
Mm.
knew this after the very first dose,
Hmm.
right?
Just didn't
It
feel
didn't
right.
take weeks or months for her to figure out that she didn't like tryptophan.
Mm.
And we switched her to 5-HTP, and oh, I love this, Mom. This works.
Oh,
So
I'm glad she
that's
saw
why
good
I don't
results.
worry about it, because it's not going to be life-threatening.
Mm.
Now, if you already know that your client or patient is sitting on a lot of inflammation and has a lot of neuroinflammation already, well, you just don't use tryptophan. You start with 5-HTP. And if it's a little too activating at bedtime, well, you use it earlier in the day because it's still going to have that serotonin melatonin effect at bedtime.
And you mentioned Julia Ross. You mentioned her book, The Mood Cure. What other resources do you? I know you have a book that you recently wrote. You were sharing that with
I
me
have a
to
book
celebrate
with,
your
of
baby.
course, I
Yeah.
want to share my book.
So for
So
those who
it's
are
called Eat,
listening, yeah.
a guide to radiant recovery using food and amino acids to repair the addicted brain, because we can repair it,
Mm.
and reduce cravings. It's also applicable for anybody dealing with mood and behavioral issues.
Mm. Mhm.
So it's very translatable. I wrote it at an eighth grade level with, you'll see lots of pictures um, to make it really
Oh
accessible
yeah,
to people. And even something
beautiful.
that you can go through with your children and help them understand some of these principles.
Mm.
So I don't dumb it down. I just made it very simple and accessible to
Mhm.
people.
Yeah, yeah.
That's
I love it.
available on Kindle, on from Amazon, or from, my websites.
Mhm.
And then depending upon what you are struggling with, there are a number of other wonderful books, some more recent, some older. One of the older books that I still turn to is called The Way Up from Down by Dr. Priscilla Slagle. I think it was written in the early 1970s. Well,
I
this
haven't read
this
that one.
information research goes way, way back. We have books on addiction recovery, such as 7 Weeks to Sobriety by Joan Matthew Larson. And then this one I just kind of rediscovered, which I kind of like the title of, How to Quit Without Feeling You Know What, by
Mhm.
Patrick Colford. This was published in 2008, and it's a wonderful review of all your substance use disorders, how they work in the brain, what creates cravings, and what nutraceuticals and foods to use to help heal the brain from these
Ah,
substance use disorders.
oh
He talks
wow.
about methylation in it.
Uh-huh.
He just goes into all sorts of wonderful things.
Okay. Sounds like a great resource. What is his background, the author's background?
He has worked as a nutritional researcher for decades. He thought
Mm.
initially he was going to become a psychotherapist. He's from the UK, but he got involved in graduate school in a research project using nutrition, and it just hooked him. And so he's been
Mm.
doing nutritional research and consulting, especially with addiction and mood disorders, ever since.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
now he's specializing in neurodegenerative disorders such as Alzheimer's.
Hmm. So some nice a nice array of resources to explore, and many of which I'm sure include, especially this book you just referenced and in yours as well. Probably have some nice references you can dig into too. So
Well, and
a little
here's
more
another one. This is another
psychonutrition.
very old book. It was published, I
Yeah.
think, in the 70s. Psychonutrition
Yeah.
by Dr. Frederick Carlson, which really goes into, a lot of people ask me, is this evidence-based?
Hmm.
Well, it's very evidence-based. And do we
Hmm.
need more research? Absolutely, we do.
Hmm.
I make some pretty strong claims when I say that missing a meal is the number one relapse trigger for all addiction.
Hmm.
Well, it'd be nice to have more research to back up that claim, but the clinical experience behind that claim, which is 30 years old, is very
Hmm.
solid. And the science behind why missing a meal sets you up for relapse, that science has also been around for 50, 60, 70 years.
Hmm. 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 And we wanted to touch on this idea of relapse as well, because I know this is something you feel really, really passionately about. Yeah.
Very passionate about.
Yeah. Yeah. So from the perspective of, psychonutrition, nutrition, as you've worked with individuals, what are some of those, I don't, maybe you've already felt like you've covered it, but is there anything that you give extra attention to or extra thought to, or any ways in which you work with people specifically with mindset or habits or strategies with this in mind?
Absolutely. But let me start with a story.
Yeah.
So, I don't know, 25 odd years ago, I was working as a relapse prevention counselor in a IV amino acid detox program, out 10-day program where they used IV aminos to get people through withdrawal to the other side and decrease cravings. Um, and this woman came into my office for her very first session with me, and she's dragging her IV pole. She sits down and bursts into tears and says, I don't know. She had a beautiful Irish accent, mid 30s maybe. Said, I don't know why I'm here. This is my third treatment program. I think I'm one of those people that the big book says is constitutionally incapable of getting and staying sober. So I know that when I leave here again, I'm going to go out and drink, and I'm wasting my time and wasting my money, and I don't even know why I'm here. My heart just broke for this woman who had just spent, by the way, a lot of money to come into this treatment program. Um, and I said, well, why do you believe that? She said, I had managed to put together 2 whole months of sobriety, white knuckling it, going to 3 meetings a day, but I did it. And I was so proud of myself. And my husband and I went to a Wayne Dyer motivational lecture seminar, and it was all about recovery. And I had this amazing spiritual awakening in the middle of his talk. And I recommitted to sobriety with everything I had in me, and I was drunk within 2 hours of leaving. See, I can't trust myself. Nothing works. The craving came out of the blue. Well, what I tell my clients is the cravings never ever come out of the blue. They may feel like they do, but when you ask the right questions, you actually realize there's a reason why the craving is here. So I shared that with this lovely young woman and said, tell me about earlier in your day. Did you eat breakfast? And she kind of laughed and she said, yes, I had a really good Irish breakfast. Eggs, bacon, onion, mushrooms, toast, a good solid breakfast. Well, did you eat lunch? Oh, no, I never eat lunch. Afternoon snack? No, never. Well, what about dinner? Well, I usually eat dinner, but, but, this time we were running late and didn't want to get to the seminar late. And so we decided we were going to have dinner after the seminar. Right? Well, this is where it really crystallized for me that missing a meal is the number one relapse trigger, at least for alcohol use disorder. I'll
Mhm.
tell you another story in a minute, which is how I realized it's all addiction. Um, and I explained to her how, after 3 to 4 hours after eating, our blood sugar drops back to normal. And then, if we're susceptible, if we have reactive hypoglycemia, it will keep dropping and keep dropping and keep dropping until it's quite low. Well, very low blood sugar, we actually die. Okay. And so the body has a built in mechanism to keep us from dying, and that's adrenaline. So blood sugar drops too low, adrenaline kicks in. And adrenaline brings blood sugar, releases stored glycogen back into the blood, glucagon, back into the bloodstream, and allows us, brings us back to baseline, keeps us from dying. That's a good thing. We don't want to die. Adrenaline does some other things. It makes us anxious and irritable and reactive and shaky, right? It destabilizes us. Well, in early recovery, um, we have a conditioned response to being emotionally destabilized to get a craving for our drug or behavior of choice to bring us back to homeostasis. So you get adrenaline from low blood sugar. First thing that happens is you get a craving. Second thing that happens is adrenaline deactivates the prefrontal cortex, right? It activates the amygdala and the brainstem and the primitive parts of our brains. We're now in fight, flight, and survival, where the addicted part of us lives. But it turns off executive functioning. Well, executive functioning is where our recovery skills live. Slowing down, pausing, remembering why it's a bad idea to pick up that drink, right? Willpower, choice, all of that lives here. Well, when this is deactivated by adrenaline, we have a craving with no access to our recovery skills. And so people very frequently will get a strong craving and relapse or engage in some other destructive behavior, switch addiction. And that was what was going on with this woman. And she thought back and she said, that's happened every single time I've
Mhm.
relapsed back into alcohol use was
Wow.
at the end of a day where I hadn't eaten anything all day.
Mhm.
She started eating 20 grams of protein because that's a nice baseline.
Mhm.
Every 4 hours, she's still sober.
What an incredible story.
Yeah. Yeah. It just blew me away. But at that time, I thought this was just alcohol. Then I had a client who had sex addiction, and he liked going to strip clubs, and it had spent a lot of time and money and energy at such places, and was really dedicated to his recovery. Very, very dedicated. So I put him on the what we call our 5-star pro recovery diet, and he was going to meetings, he was taking supplements, he was doing really well until one day he came in just so despondent and the shame was just dripping off him. He said, Saturday afternoon, the craving just came out of the blue and I just couldn't resist it. And I went to my old club. He said, I don't know what happened. I said, well, tell me about earlier in your day. Did you have breakfast? Well, my boss called me at 7:30 in the morning and called me to work for an emergency. So he didn't have breakfast. He didn't have any of his morning amino acids or supplements. About 11 o'clock in the morning, the thought of his club just started dancing. If he'd eaten then, if he'd taken the amino acid glutamine then, I think he would have been fine. But he just pushed it away, pushed it away. No, I'm not going to do that. Pushed it away. He works through lunch and he gets off work. So now he skipped 2 meals and all of his aminos. And it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And he had missed his window of opportunity. The craving was in full force. He had no more choice, and he went to his club, spent a couple of hours there, left, realized he was hungry, and went to McDonald's. And I said, what do you think would have happened had you gone to McDonald's first? He thought about it and he said, oh, I would have just gone home. And that's when I realized that this low blood sugar with its resulting adrenaline and losing our recovery skills applies to all addiction. And since then, I've just seen it, be true
Mm,
over and over and over and over
mm,
again.
mhm. As you've been engaging in that interviewing process with folks,
Mhm. Yeah,
it's that thread that's carrying.
it's
Yeah.
just that thread. People will
Yeah.
tell me, well, I have a craving or I had a slip. And I'll say, well,
Yeah.
you know, I know you were eating protein every 4
Mm-hmm.
hours. What
Mm-hmm.
happened on this particular day? And they think
Mm-hmm.
back and say, oh yeah, that's the day where I didn't,
Mm-hmm.
where I
Yeah.
skipped the snack or I skipped lunch or I
Yeah.
was in 2 hours late. And it was like, oh, MG, it keeps proving itself to me.
Yeah.
Right. So
Yeah.
I ask a question of all my clients that I've now been asking for 25 years, and that is, when was the last time you ate protein prior to your panic attack, your domestic violence incident, your craving, your use, your often whatever? And so much of the time, it's been longer than 4 hours.
Mm-hmm. And this is bringing up another key point that it sounds like you're not just referring to missing a meal, but you're talking about specific types of meals. You're not talking about the big Dunkin' Donuts coffee with the donut, not that kind of meal, but a
I
blood
am
sugar
certainly not.
stabilizing meal. And you mentioned this idea of the 5-star pro recovery diet, which we've talked about before. But
Mhm.
share more about that too, as because I think that's another part of your approach that's so well thought out.
Well, it really is. So there's so many diets out there,
Mm,
and they're very confusing.
mm,
Should I be a vegan? There's people who thrive on vegan diets, and then people who don't. There's carnivores. There's people who thrive just eating meat, and those that don't, right? So how on earth are we? And then there's keto, and it can be very bewildering. It's bewildering to me. So I thought through what's the foundation? What do we really need to be thinking about? And I went back to what are the nutrients the brain requires to function?
it's a good place
Well,
to
it
start.
requires amino acids from protein and the right fats and the right cofactor nutrients. Where do we get these from? Well, we get them from protein, healthy fats, and a variety of fruits and vegetables, along with some whole grains. All right, what else do we need? Well, we've got biochemical individuality. Everybody's a little different. Some people does better vegan, some people do better carnivore. So we want to personalize it.
Mm,
And then we want to avoid toxins. So it needs to be clean as we can afford it and as possible,
sure.
because our livers and our brains are already overly toxic and we just don't want to add to it. So the 5-star pro recovery diet, star one is protein, star two is healthy fats, because we found that people are more likely to commit suicide with very low levels of cholesterol and very low levels of omega-3 fatty acids. So we need the right fats. Um, so protein, fats, star number three is your complex carbohydrates, mostly vegetables with a few other things thrown in,
Mm,
personalized and clean.
and clean. Yeah.
5 stars.
So 5 stars. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then we dance through these because the
Mm,
personalization star is very important. Some people do better eating different types of protein because of different blood types or different metabolic types or ethnic groups, or, so
Mm.
it's not just one size fits all,
Mhm.
but whatever you land on, you want to make sure that you are getting all the nutrients your brain requires.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
if you're vegan, then you need to be supplementing with vitamin B12
Mhm.
and biotin and probably some carnitine.
Mhm. Something in
So
the algae or yeah,
yeah,
like
you've got to get those nutrients
ADHD.
somewhere because
Yeah.
otherwise you are going to have symptoms.
Mm. The body can only go so long without essential nutrients. Yeah, without
Yeah.
consequences. So true.
Yeah.
So we have covered so much, perspective, experience, and just some of the approaches that you take. I think my final question for you, Christina, would be for someone who is in that place where they are really discouraged about their recovery
Mhm.
and they're feeling hopeless, and maybe they're listening to this right now and they're wondering, maybe they're overwhelmed and they're thinking where to begin, right?
Mhm.
You've given some really tangible strategies here, but what would you say to that person?
Eat a high protein breakfast and pick up the phone and call me. And if you can't pick up the phone and call me, get my book.
Mhm.
And then pick up the phone and call me. Um,
Okay. Yeah, reaching out for support, reaching out for support. I really
exactly.
appreciate that message because
Yeah. And
having
I've
those
trained a lot
supportive,
of coaches, so it's
yeah,
not just me. I've trained a lot of
yeah.
coaches over the years
Yes.
who are well trained to work with anybody through
Yeah.
any degree of intricacy.
Yeah. Yeah. And you've been in this field doing this work for a long time.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, Christina, anything else as we close? Anything else to share, to say?
You know, in my journey, as I said, it took me from first walking into Julia Ross's office and getting introduced to her nutritionist to discovering the final of 11 biochemical drivers. It was really hard in those 15 years. And I also had a lot of actual trauma that I also had to heal from. And teaching myself all of this, finding the right resources, teasing about all the strands, at times it was very discouraging, and I went into despair and I collapsed in tears on my living room floor, and I felt very hopeless. But the one thing kept me going, well, two things kept me going. One is that I wanted to use my own pain and my own journey to help other people heal from theirs. That was a prayer of mine from the age of 20, and I think God's answered that prayer. And the other thing is, I never gave up. I never gave up. There are lots of dead ends, but it was like, okay, what's the next good thing I can do? What's the very next good thing I can do? And I just kept going. I just kept going and I just kept going and I kept praying and I kept getting creative and I kept learning new things. And here I am today, in my upper 60s, building a whole new career. And I haven't had to deal with these intense struggles for at least 25 years.
Mhm. It's a
So
beautiful
there's
next
always
chapter.
hope.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we can leave it at that with words of hope. Thank you,
Yeah.
Christina, for joining. I'll be linking some additional resources from you in the show notes, whatever you'd like people to see in terms of website URLs and things like that, your book, if people want to check that out. So really appreciate your time and your well-won wisdom from all of
Oh,
these
you're
years.
so welcome. Well, and yours as well, Sarah. And this has just been lovely, this
Yes,
conversation.
yes, it has been. Be well, Christina.
You too. Bye bye.
Thank you for listening to the Nourished Brain podcast. If today's episode inspired you, I'd love for you to subscribe, leave a review, or share it with someone who could use it. Until next time, stay curious, stay grounded, and stay nourished.